Welcome back, everyone, to our 2021 final podcast. Sorry for some technical difficulties there, but we're going to go ahead and get started with our final guest, Dr. Laura Goodman, who is an extension range specialist in the Natural Resource Ecology Management Department, which I always enjoy having specialists come from that department because we get to talk about so much between the relationships of plants and animals. And Dr. Goodman, you'll recognize her from being on the show previously. We talked about wildflowers, so thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Casey.
So, sorry for the little delay there.
That's okay.
Normally everything is a little bit smoother, but you know, the wind, I think let's blame it on the wind today.
Yeah, for sure.
So how are you doing this morning?
Good. Blew in here.
Yeah.
For sure, but yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about what range management is and your background and how you got into that.
Yeah. So I originally was looking at what different majors I could study for my bachelor's, and I had been on a trip to Belize, and that kind of sparked my interest in learning about how to help feed people and also help them figure out what might be lacking in their diet. So I'm originally from Western Minnesota, or I'm from Minneapolis area, but my family farms in Western Minnesota,
Okay.
and they made me interested in agronomy and just growing crops in general, and so that's what sparked my interest in that. And when I was looking at universities, I ended up going to Abilene Christian University in Texas, and the degree there was a mixture between agronomy and range, and so they didn't have enough faculty for just the agronomy part.
So you wanted to get away from those Minnesota winters, huh?
Yes. Yeah, my poor parents. I told them that I wanted to just go somewhere completely new. Not that I don't like my family, but I just wanted to try somewhere very different. And it was.
I was going to say, that's a pretty extreme difference, Abilene, Texas.
So different.
So being there, you got interested in range management, and that's kind of what sealed the deal for you?
Yeah, so the classes that I took that were in the range part of my degree were just so interesting to me. The interactions between the soil and the plants and the animals that use them, that just fascinated me, the ecology behind it. So when I went on for a master's and a PhD, I pursued the range. Range ecology was what I wanted to do.
So where did you go for your schooling after that?
So I went to school at New Mexico State in Las Cruces, and my master's research I studied how to decrease a toxic plant in pastures, and I compared some different approaches. I used some different herbicides, and then I also used sheep, and so we were trying to do these different types of grazing to make sure that it wasn't going to be harmful to them, but to try to remove those plants from the pasture prior to putting cattle in those pastures, kind of in northeastern New Mexico. So, and then in my PhD, also at New Mexico State, I looked at how animals decide where they're going to graze in a pasture and how can we change.
Getting into the psychology of the animal.
Yes, yeah, we did behavior tests on 300 commercial cows, a lot of cows, and then put GPS collars on some.
I was going to say, because they have like Fitbit now for cows, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like we were using GPS collars. You can put pedometers, you can do lots of different things. And so we were just trying to figure out how to change their decisions in some cases, and also identify the animals that were that stayed in the herd the longest.
Okay, so when you're saying change their decision, like it's not like you were like, hey cow, I've told you don't go there, you need to go here. Were you moving their water and their food sources? Is that how you change behavior in a cow?
Yeah, so generally you can use supplement, especially in the winter when there's not a lot else growing. You can use supplement to draw them to different parts
like
of the
minerals,
pasture.
you're talking, okay.
Yep, protein supplement, you can use minerals. You can use herding. There's just some innate behavioral differences between animals, and that's actually what I was looking at. So there's some animals that just kind of have a go-getter kind of personality, and they'll just use bigger areas of a pasture than an animal that's kind of lazy and likes to hang out at water. And those animals that are kind of more
Is
lazy.
that based off of age or just personality?
No, it's
Okay.
not based off of age. Although,
Like the older ones are just like, we're not as fit. We don't want to get around
we
as
had
much.
some older cows that were amazing.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, we were working in pretty large pastures. So one of our pastures was 2,000 acres, and the other one was like 4,000.
Oh, wow.
So they could cover some ground if they wanted to, and
Yeah.
some of them did. But yeah, actually, as they aged, the ones that were lazy ended up being culled from the herd, and that was because they just ended up not always having a calf.
Oh, right.
And so they were.
So they were lazy all across the board.
Yeah. Yes, Casey. So anyway, that was some really interesting research, but that's kind of what started me on the behavior research side
Okay.
with cattle.
Okay, which kind of, I'm going to jump a little bit because I think this is a natural tie into what you're doing now with goats, right?
Yeah.
So this is a fun topic, and you've been monitoring a goat herd.
Yes. So we so we have research here in Stillwater where we have GPS collars on cows, goats, and actually our guard dogs that are living with the goats. And so we're looking at how they're using the pasture and what vegetation types that they're spending most of their time in.
Uh-huh.
This is in pastures that have been patch burn grazed, and so we have a quarter section pasture, and we only burn a sixth of it in the summer, and then another sixth in the winter. And then the next year we burn a different sixth, and so we move around. So basically a third of the pasture.
Which
is
means,
burned.
like, that's kind of manipulating, you hope, right? Their
Oh, yes.
behavior, too, because they want that fresh, new growth. So where you've burned, they're going to go to. Is that?
Yeah, it's extremely effective
Okay,
at
okay.
moving. Yeah, so because of the really nutritious growth that grows on those patches, the former research that had been done with just cattle found that they spent about 70% of their time on those recently burned patches. And so we wanted to see if this also held true for goats, because goats use, they aren't just using, they use grass, they eat a lot of grass, but they also use a lot of woody plants. And so we just didn't know how that relationship would work with our goat selection.
So tell us a little bit about why we want to move the herd around. Why is that important?
So there's a number of reasons why. One is that animals will tend to use the same area over and over. They can actually maintain a grazing patch short, and so that area will regrow, and they'll go back and regraze it again, and it'll regrow, and they'll go back and regraze it again. And so that eventually...
So they're making their own new growth by regrazing an area.
Yes. And when they do that, it can eventually be harmful for the plants if it's happening year after year. So we were trying to... So with patch burn grazing, we're manipulating where they're grazing and moving them around ourselves. And so you actually get... Over a number of years, you actually get more even use across the whole pasture than if you just burned the whole pasture or didn't burn the whole pasture, and they were picking the spots that they liked best in
Which
the pasture.
I imagine spreads the manure or the fertilizer, the nutrients, and also the compaction
Yep.
around that field, making it more uniform.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting things, so patch burn grazing research in Oklahoma has been going on for about 20 years. And so that, one of the interesting things that we found is just how the plants are responding to that. And so you have a different set of plants that are growing on a recently burned patch. Our perennial grasses and our broadleaf plants and shrubs all come back. But because they've been burned and then grazed, they're kept down for a short period of time, and that allows a lot of these other broadleaf plants to grow, which is really good for a lot of our wildlife species. So you have this mixture of broadleaf plants, really tall grasses in the unburned areas, and shrubs also in the unburned areas, and so it provides this diversity of habitat, and it also provides a diversity of forage for the livestock, so they can get lots of quantity in the area that hasn't been burned for a while, but the highest qualities in the recently burned spot. So
Okay.
you're providing them with kind of everything they need.
Okay, and I know we're flashing up some resources for people if they're interested in this, because there is, and that's like another whole, I know you participate in some of the prescribed burn stuff, but that's another whole person's area of specialty, right?
Yeah,
So.
yeah. So John Weir does the extension program for prescribed burning here at Oklahoma State, and we work together a lot on different research and extension. And so we work together for developing content for social media, and we're also both on a recent grant that's across 4 states, and we call it the Prairie Project. And so that's the goat research that you're referring to is research for the Prairie Project.
Okay. So are you finding that the goats are doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Well, we've just had them since last January, and so we don't have a lot of data yet to tell you for sure. Okay. We're working on that right now. We have a PhD student that's working on it. His name's Alex Barnes, and so we'll be keeping people posted if they follow our social media accounts. And they can see what's going on there. But so far, we're seeing in the winter, and this is held true with other research with goats, is that they use a lot of woody plants in the winter. Okay. And they like to strip bark off of plants in the winter. And this is actually one way that they can kill the top growth of different plants. So we're seeing it a lot on our sumac. We have winged sumac and flame leaf sumac and smooth sumac, and the sumac that they're stripping will follow this spring and see if it dies. You know, much of this has been burned, so some of it had already been top killed, and then it just resprouts from the base. Mm-hmm. But we want to see what the combination of the burning and the goat use is doing. It's the problem for Oklahoma and Texas is that we're kind of losing the battle with woody plants, and so a lot of our grasslands and prairies are converting over to woodlands, and that is not good for our wildlife. It's not good for our livestock production, and that's actually what was the impetus behind us trying to get this grant, was that there was a USDA grant that the proposal, you needed to say how you would increase production on rangelands, and it was for broader than just rangelands, and so that you can say how you can increase production in agricultural fields. It's not easy, but it's easier to increase production with inputs. Mm-hmm. But on rangelands, you're kind of limited by how much rain you get, and so there's kind of only 2 ways you can increase how much you produce, and that's prescribed fire has been shown to increase production of our native grasses. And the other way is to add another grazer. And so if you just have cattle, you're not going to be using all of the different plant species that you have.
And maybe we should define what range is.
Yeah.
Because I think, we think agriculture, pastures, farmland, but tell us what range is.
Yeah, that's a funny
Maybe
question.
I should have started there.
That's okay. So when I talk to people on airplanes, they're like, "What do you do?" And I'm a range scientist. And, well, what is that?
Yeah.
Like, have you heard the Home on the Range? Like, but so rangelands are lots of different things. You can grasslands, shrublands, woodlands, deserts. A lot of our rangelands are deserts in North America. But they're basically land that is primarily used for livestock and wildlife. It's not farmed, and it's usually not farmed because it has some, limitations. So
meaning you're not even taking hay off of it or grass or anything.
Well, you can.
Oh, okay.
You can hay it.
Okay.
Yep, you can hay it. That happens a lot in Oklahoma.
Okay.
But usually the limitations would be like it's too rocky for farming, or the soil's too shallow, or it's too sandy, or it's in a desert.
Okay.
It just doesn't get.
You're just not planting a crop, tilling it and planting it.
Yeah. So the thing that kind of is consistent across all of these different systems is that rangelands all have native plants growing on them, or that's that's the goal.
Right. Those goats are going to help with that, right?
We can have a lot of invasive plants, but typically they're not planted to something.
Okay.
So this wouldn't be like Bermuda grass pasture. This is growing native plants that have always lived in these systems for centuries. And so that's what rangelands are in general. And we don't manage them the same way as you would either crops or planted forages, because it typically doesn't pay for itself to use fertilizers, and these plants have developed to live in kind of low fertility systems, and so they have these strong relationships with microbes in the soil and mycorrhizal fungi on their roots, and those are helping to provide them with some nutrients, and when you fertilize, you actually kind of mess up that relationship. And so we don't typically use fertilizers. Broadcast herbicide application isn't usually going to pay for itself with the livestock production off of that land. So we do use herbicides to control some plants, but usually not like a broadcast application like you would in some crop systems. So those are the differences.
So what are some of the plants that are the noxious weeds in these areas in our Oklahoma range?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many. So there's a couple of big whammy plants. So Sericea lespedeza is one. It's a legume. We have native lespedezas as well that grow here. Slender lespedeza, roundhead lespedeza.
And I think that's important. So we have native.
But native.
The Sericea lespedeza is the invasive. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And that plant is a problem because it really kind of can take over portions of the pasture. So actually we just finished up some research a couple years ago looking at different ways of managing without herbicides for Sericea lespedeza. And we were comparing this patch burn grazing versus not using patch burn grazing, just burning the entire pasture every 3 years. And what we found was that in the areas that weren't being treated with patch burn grazing, the Sericea population had increased, and it was actually about 20% cover of the whole pasture was Sericea lespedeza. Wow. So that's
significant.
A lot. And then in the patch burn pastures, we've stabilized for more than 10 years at about 9%, 8 or 9%, between 8 and 9%. And so it's been able to stabilize the Sericea lespedeza without any kind of herbicide, which was excellent. And so now we're doing research at the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, looking at how that patch burn grazing would compare if you were using herbicide in addition to try to kill some of the plants initially, and then using patch burn grazing we actually can stimulate some of the seed production with burning, and then killing those seedlings with a herbicide. So that's we have 1,000 acre pastures.
So you're trying to get that seed bank to germinate and come out, basically. Yeah.
The hardest part about Sericea lespedeza is that the seeds are viable for a really long time. We don't know exactly, but probably between 20 and 30 years.
Oh my goodness.
So whatever strategy you use for controlling Sericea, you're going to be doing it for a really long time.
Okay.
So
you've got job security.
I do.
Okay.
Oh God. But so that's some of the research that we're doing. We'll be having some extension field days to show folks what we're finding.
So why is Johnson grass not a noxious weed? It seems like it's.
Why is it not listed at the state?
Yeah.
That's a complicated question. So it should be.
It's invasive. I mean, it's not native, right? It's not.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and it can definitely take over, especially in hayed pastures. So Johnson grass is actually pretty palatable grass for cattle.
Right.
And so it tends to disappear in grazed pastures, but it is.
It like colonizes though.
Yeah,
it just can be.
You know what it does? It puts all of its resources into growing its rhizomes, its underground, before it ever starts to really try to put on a lot of leaves, and so it just.
So by the time you're seeing it, it's the problem's there underground.
So that definitely a problem plant, as you know, and you see it a lot in ditches, and it's a big monster grass, but.
And I think that's it. It's such a flag, you know what I mean? So it's just more noticeable, probably. Yeah. Even though there might be obviously a lot more of the Sericea that
Yeah, I don't know how much people notice Sericea until it's like August. When it's small, cattle will eat it. And actually, that's part of the goats our interest in and using the goats as well is because those pastures have a lot of Sericea that the goats are in.
Yeah,
so.
I think you have a video that you aired on your social media,
Yes.
which you guys are active on social media. You have website, Instagram, YouTube.
Yeah, we have, it's Oklahoma Lands on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And then we put all the videos that we make for social media on our YouTube channel, and that's OSU Natural Resources Extension. But we put a GoPro on a goat. We've done it a couple times now to just watch what she's eating. We're doing some diet studies with these goats, but we wanted to just see what she was eating.
So you had this tally.
Yeah, it was actually, she took such fast bites that it was.
I know, I have to compliment you on your ID because I was like.
We had to slow them down, freeze the frames to get some of them because she just took the fastest, and it was making people motion sick. So we sped parts of it up, slowed parts of it down to try to make it a little bit less jerky. But so we did that in May, and then we did it in August, and we'll be showing that one pretty soon. And then we did it again just last week or 2 weeks ago.
So has their diet changed between the seasons with what's seasonally available?
So in the August, so you guys can see what she did in May on social media or YouTube.
Okay, that's the one that we have.
Yeah, that's the one you have. She ate lots of different plants. And then in August, she spent almost all of the time that she had the GoPro on in our recently burned patch. We had burned a patch in August. So those plants are even harder to identify because they're
small.
Teeny tiny little regrowth. Probably some sedges. It's hard to tell. I'll be honest. But anyway, so we're working on that right now. But she spent all of that time just eating on that nutrition. And in August, a lot of our other grasses have already headed out, and their quality has decreased quite a bit. So it's not surprising that she had switched to the patch burn at that time of year. And at the end of the year and at the beginning of the year, you'd expect for them to be using the burned patches even more heavily because they're the first to green up and the last to go dormant.
Okay. So are you going to be burning again this year? And are you doing it this time of year, or when are you burning?
So we burn in August, and then it's usually February, March-ish when we burn. Well, February is usually when we burn in the spring.
Okay.
So those burns are coming up. So we'll be tracking what they do. If you want to watch a prescribed burn, we have some videos of that on our social media as well if you're just interested in what we did. We're working with...
Because it's a very coordinated, organized thing. I mean, it's...
It is. Yeah, well, so you should have a burn plan written up for the location that you're going to burn, and you should have, what wind direction you want to burn under, what humidity, what wind speed, and so those are all important. And then, having a crew that knows what they're doing. And so there's actually prescribed burn training online that you can take. That's just, so you can at least get started. And then if you want to actually start doing burns, look at the Oklahoma Prescribed Burn Associations because you can burn with them.
I was going to say there's a lot of, and especially in smaller, more rural areas, there's groups of people that come together, and you can be a part of that and get help for your place or help others and learn the process a little bit. So.
And we do field days. I'll put a plug in for our field days that we do. We typically do at least 2 during the summer about doing prescribed burning. We try to be to do a burn at those field days, so you can carry a drip torch or help spray, help carry a leaf blower.
Carrying a drip torch, that is literally
lighting.
Dropping fire, right?
Yep, you're dropping the fuel and lighting along the way.
Yeah. So that's the fun tool.
Yes, it is.
So tell us a little bit about because fire can affect what grows back.
Yeah.
right? And you can affect the plant material that way, whether it's forbs or grasses. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when you burn more regularly, you're going to push your pasture to be more grass dominated, because there's just not, especially if you're doing like annual burn. So that in the Flint Hills and Northeast Oklahoma, some folks burn every year, and especially when you burn in the dormant season, when you're burning in January, February, you're pushing your pastures to be more grassy. You get less broadleaf plants in your pasture, and of course less woody plants. And so you can kind of pick what you're trying to manage for in your pasture, and select the frequency of how often you're burning, the season of burn, and then also the fire intensity is extremely important. And so the more intense your fires are, the less woody plants you typically have in those pastures as well. So if you can have higher fire intensity if you have more fuels, or if you burn when it's with different wind speeds and that kind of thing. And so you can help to manage your pasture in different ways depending on what your goals are.
Is there an ideal like percentage of forbs to grasses in? And I know that probably depends on your intention with that range. So whether you're trying to graze it, or you have it for ecology, quail or whatever. But is there a general forb to grass ratio?
So your pastures, especially, we're in the cross timbers, which is a mixture of tall grass prairie and wooded areas. That's where still water is. And parts of Oklahoma, of course, are just tall grass prairie, and then there's mixed grass prairie kind of on the southwest and west side, and then there's shrublands as well. So it depends on what system you're in, what the potential of that system is. In tall grass prairie areas, you're always going to be mostly grass dominated. But you can push it to have more broadleaf plants by using burning, and especially if you use burning and grazing together. You can also do to some degree with grazing, but then there's folks that try to do these kinds of things with brush hogging or mowing, and it just doesn't have the same impact. We've been doing some research here, John Weir and I, on the season of burn and how what time of burn, when you burn affects the plants that respond. And so something that was really interesting that we found was that our summer burns, our June, July burns, and our August, September burns had the most flowering plants, the greatest species diversity.
Oh, really? Okay.
And the greatest quantity. And so I don't think that's intuitive for very many people, because it's like, well, why would you burning in the summer make you have more flowers? But
right.
It does, and a lot of our
you would think you would kind of be
interrupting
losing
it.
Yeah, interrupting them.
But so many of them come right back, and they'll actually rebloom. So even if you burn them when they're blooming, like green antelope horn milkweed will just rebloom. It'll regrow and rebloom. It might be.
Is it sort of like deadheading, and it's still like, you didn't let me get my seed out there, and I still have to get this.
They do it pretty quickly.
Okay.
Purple passion flower, passion vine. That's another one that just goes crazy. It'll grow back and rebloom, and
which is a beautiful plant. We have that in our home garden a lot of times.
So pretty.
Yeah. Well, when I first saw that, I grew up in Sapulpa out in Creek County on some land in the rocky area of eastern Oklahoma. And I saw that growing, and I thought it was like some tropical plant. I was like, how did this... It was just out in the wild growing, and it just looks so tropical to be an Oklahoma plant.
I agree. I 100% agree. Actually, we have a plant webpage, and we have that plant on that webpage, and we had shared it on our social media the other day, and there were some comments about like people couldn't believe that was just out in a pasture.
Right, and there are tropical species of that plant, but yeah. So is that the Plant ID?
Yeah,
website?
It's called plantidin3d.
Okay.
.com, and so we created these. There's this app called Fuse. It's FYUSE, and you can make 3D images, and it basically takes lots and lots of pictures and stitches them together. so then you can kind of manipulate and go, on the other side of a plant if you want to. Actually, we have one of the green antelope horn milkweed one that we have. If you go around to the other side of it, it has a little monarch caterpillar on the back side of it. It's so cute. So, but if you're interested in plants, we have, I think about 100 on there so far. We're just going to keep adding them as we create more. And I don't know, we're creating some OSU plant web pages. If you're familiar with the livestock breeds web page that Oklahoma State has, we're creating a big plant web page kind of like that with folks from horticulture and plant and soil science and natural resource ecology management, all kind of working together to make a big plant web page. And so we're making the fuses for that, but we needed somewhere to house them just until we have that ready. And so that's what we made the Plant ID in 3D. Okay,
so I would recommend, some of them are probably more range plants, but some of them are wildflowers that as home gardeners we're always interested in, or in the springtime when they're blooming, it's like, what is that red flower out there? So
there's lots of them.
That's pretty neat. So tell us a little bit, you've got a lot going on with social media. Let's plug that again. You're on
Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and it's Oklahoma Lands, all one word, together. And then on YouTube, our YouTube channel is OSU Natural Resources Extension, if you're interested in looking at videos. So
okay, all right. And we want to tell everybody that's watching online, hello, and thanks for joining us. Sorry for the little delay, but if you have any questions, please feel free to chime in with those questions. We've got another Laura monitoring that. So we have somebody who's asking about their goats are peeling the bark off of their cedars, and it's actually declining the health of that cedar, which some people might say, great for that. But I have a feeling this was an intentional planted cedar that maybe the goats need to be in a cage, in a pen or something. So
so they can kill them
because they could girdle that tree.
Exactly.
I would imagine, kind of like squirrels do.
So it'll usually take it will take a while for it to die, but it can kill it. So if you want to keep that cedar, I would
put chicken wire or something around.
Yep, you could do that. We don't ever try to stop goats from killing cedar, so it's hard for me.
This is
it's hard for me to. I don't usually get that question.
That's the difference between our audiences there. She's like, good job, goat. So that's pretty interesting, what the goats are going after. So do you find that they're like, is that a desperate goat that would want to eat a woody plant versus
No, so goats have so goats and cows are very different in their mouth structures and their digestive tract. So cows are made to eat large quantities of forage, and grasses don't really try to defend themselves from grazing. They just regrow really fast, and that's.
And let me ask real quick. Sorry to interrupt you, but what does grazing do to the grass? As far as it depletes the root zone also, doesn't it?
It depends. So if you're not grazing heavily continuously, for many grass species, it doesn't deplete their root system. But if you're grazing heavily, if you're grazing, down to 5 or 6 less than 5 or 6 inches every year, then it can. But grasses differ in their ability to recover from grazing, and most of the grasses in Oklahoma, have had grazing for a long, long time, and so they're very well adapted to it. They're well adapted to grazing, fire, drought, kind of all of those things. So it really depends. All grazing definitely isn't equal, but in some cases, grazing actually promotes new buds to put up new tillers,
so it's the intensity and the
also timing.
Quantity,
Yep, and then it's nice for these grasses to get a rest every now and then, kind of when they've started to try to put on their seed heads. So that would be later in the, so like July through when they go dormant in the winter. It's nice for them to have a rest at that time of year every now and then. You don't have to do it every year, but you could do it every 4 or 5 years, and that's part of why people typically don't have only one pasture. They're moving animals between pastures, but.
So goats and cattle are different.
Oh, they're so different. Yeah, sorry. So cattle eat large quantities. They eat grasses. Grasses don't defend themselves, so they don't have all these. They don't have different structures that are pokey as much, and they also don't have secondary compounds in them that make them unpalatable. So broadleaf plants and shrubs do. So they have tannins and terpenes, and there's a lot of
they have things that make it not taste good.
Yeah, and so they'll make the animal feel sick after they eat them if they aren't adapted to eating those. And so goats, because their mouth parts are so small, they can pick the parts of the plant that's the least toxic.
Okay.
And then they have different proteins in their saliva to start breaking down like tannins immediately once they've consumed that plant. And of course they're ruminants, so they're regurgitating and rechewing that. And so that saliva helps with breaking that down. And then their liver and their kidneys are actually, relative to their body size, they're larger than in a cow. And so that helps them to kind of process those toxins and stuff. And so, yep. And actually even how much that animal has been exposed to those plants early in life can even change their some of the anatomy of their digestive tract to help them be more adapted to eating those plants.
So do you do a cow-goat rotation? Like the goats come in and clean up after the cows, or is that? So
some people do that,
okay.
and you can, that works well too. We have all of our animals in the same pasture, okay. So we've got 3/4 sections that we're doing this with, that are goats plus cows, and then we have 3/4 sections that are cattle only. But some folks like to keep them separate. And the researchers that we're working with on the Prairie Project that are in Texas also have sheep in the mix. So they have the full gamut of all of grazers.
And do sheep vary much from goats, or?
So sheep eat less browse than they eat less woody plants than goats do. Mm-hmm. They eat more broadleaf plants than goats and cattle.
Oh. Okay.
So it depends on what you're trying to do,
right?
Which species you should pick. But that's, with the issue of woody plants, we kind of need to use every tool we have to try to combat it. And the other thing is just the amount of money that ends up being spent on controlling woody plants is it's a lot. It's so expensive to do mechanical control, and unfortunately, sometimes people don't have the time to maintain it after they've done some type of mechanical control. So then they just end up, 10 years down the road, they're kind of back where they started.
Right.
And so the idea with this grant was, if we can increase productivity by adding another species and by using prescribed fire, while battling the biggest issue on our rangelands in Oklahoma, Texas, Nebraska, and Kansas, we got to make that work. And we know it works. We just don't have a lot of people adopting those different practices. Mm-hmm. And so Texas is the #1 meat goat producer in the nation.
Okay.
And actually Oklahoma is number 4. So
really?
A little known fact. Yes. There's more goat production. So the knowledge is here.
Uh-huh.
It's just not all of our goats are on rangeland, and that's really where they can make the biggest impact, is where they're in these native pastures where they can have access to those woody plants and help us to open up some of the understory in some of these areas. So goats and fire are both best for controlling plants when they're small.
So we're getting a little outside of my world, but I still think it's interesting. So I'm wondering, do goats need different requirements? Like if you had, as far as the application, I'm assuming you're working with a lot of beef producers and things like that. So can you easily put goats in an area where cattle have always been, as far as the fencing and the security, like? Yep. Because there's a lot of coyotes out there.
Yeah. So you're bringing up
a whole nother,
exactly.
No, that's other hour for the podcast.
But the biggest issue for goats is infrastructure, fences, predators, and parasites. Those are kind of the big things.
Okay.
So fence is a big deal, and the fence we put in is a net wire fence, and it's working really, really well. We've only had the goats get out once, and that was because somebody left a gate open.
Oh.
Actually, if you wanted to see,
Don't blame the goats.
No, don't blame the goats. It wasn't their fault. If you want to see, we used our infrared drone because it was one of those snowy days, and so we used our infrared drone to find them. Anyway, side story, that's on social media.
Technology and ag right there.
Yeah. But you can add additional strands of barbed wire to an existing five-strand barbed wire fence. So some folks will do a 10-strand barbed wire fence with most of the additional strands all being kind of towards the bottom. Mm-hmm. Or some folks do net wire on the lower half of their existing barbed wire fence to keep goats in, and that works. That's worked for folks that I know in Oklahoma that have
Okay.
goats. We put net wire that's we completely replaced our barbed wire fences on our pastures, but you wouldn't necessarily have to do it. So it's a big expense to start out with, but we're actually working with Deer OPO.
But you're looking at a long-term management versus what you were saying, mechanical, you fixed it, but then 10 years later you've got the same problem again. So.
Yeah, exactly. And with a lot of the folks that have had goats for a long time, they're like, how do I graze so I don't completely deplete all of my woody plants or all of my Sericea lespedeza, because that's their feed and I don't want to kill all of it. Mm-hmm. So they, if you have them for long enough, that can be an issue, that you actually run out of their preferred forage. Now they eat
the
grass
carrying
too.
Capacity of the, yeah.
And then the predators, so we have guard dogs with ours. And
what kind of dogs are they?
They are Akbash dogs.
Oh, okay, I don't even
There's
know what that is.
Anatolian
Are they
Akbash,
big?
Great Pyrenees. Big white dogs.
Okay, Great Pyrenees.
Big
Okay.
white dogs.
That gives me
Yeah.
some sort of reference there.
Yep. So they're excellent. They've worked really, really well for us. We did try donkeys, and
I was gonna say, don't people use donkeys?
Yeah, the donkeys might have worked for us if we have the 3/4 sections all border each other, and so our donkeys just wanted to kind of hang in the corners.
You had lazy donkeys.
See each other. We did. They wanted to be by each other and not necessarily with the goats. And our dogs are. They love their goats.
Good.
So we don't have that problem with them as much.
Excellent. Well, and I think that's what's fascinating about your department and talking with specialists in your department, because it's such a relationship, and I think that's what any gardener, we experience, that it is a relationship. It's not just about the plants. It's about that relationship between the soil and our effect on those plants, what we're doing, how we're maintaining those plants.
Yeah.
That can affect them later on, and the wildlife, the ecology. There's a lot of factors to consider with it all. So
yeah,
it's pretty fascinating. So I know this was a little bit of a kind of a diversion a little bit from our traditional garden related podcast, but I still think it's fascinating because so many of us as gardeners are driving along the roads and we're seeing those plants out there. And seeing the prairie. We all have an interest in the prairie. So any last things that you want to add about or share with us? Or
I just really encourage you to follow us on social media to kind of keep up with what we're doing as far as field days, and the Prairie Project social media is Prairie Restored if you're interested in that. We do share that we share a lot of that content on ours as well, our social media. So that'll keep you connected to what we're doing with the research and extension activities. So check those out.
And we were talking before the podcast a little bit, so putting this into application a little bit, you also are a professor here and teach classes, and so some of your senior students that are studying this are learning how to make management plans for whatever the producer is wanting to do, whether that's wildlife ecology or hay or grazing, right?
Yeah.
And so they kind of work to create a map for that producer on what to do.
Exactly. So we get to visit some properties, and they are given the goals that that manager has, be it livestock production or specific wildlife species, or in controlling some invasive species that they have on their property. And so the students develop a management plan, and they give specific recommendations about if you're going to graze animals, this is what the stocking rate should be for different categories. If it's a cow-calf operation or a stocker operation, and then if they wanted to manage for, a lot of folks want either white-tailed deer or turkey or quail. How would you make the optimal mix of habitat for those different species? And so they write management plans about that, and recommendations for controlling invasive species, prescribe fire plans.
So
they work hard.
It's not a one size fits all, though. It's
No.
very sort of like, it depends on what your intention is with that space. So.
Yeah, and that's really the goal behind it, is to hopefully we want to fit the recommendation to what their goal is for their land.
Mm-hmm.
And there's limitations based on where they live and the plant communities that they have growing on their property, but we try to make it work if it can work at their place.
Right.
So,
well, I think it's fascinating, and I'm glad you guys are worried about this and taking care of this for us. It's always nice to know that there's somebody battling that fight for you. So we appreciate you joining us, Dr. Goodman, and we know we'll probably see you again on the show at some time. Probably going to follow up with you on that, do a video or segment on Oklahoma gardening with the goats, because that's just fun video.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us today.
no problem. Thanks, Casey.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.